It's time to implement QA procedures before you launch your next VR game, so let's find out how to do that. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo, a VR developer, evangelist, and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. Today, Remy Bustani, Christian Willett, and Preston O'Brien, the guys that created the VR game TSA Frisky, will be chatting with me all about QAing VR games. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
So let's start with Remy. Give us a little bit about your background. How did you get into VR? And then we'll go around the table.
Sure. So I've been into VR since the Oculus Kickstarter in 2012. I immediately switched to a Samsung phone so I could get my hands on a Gear VR. I pre-ordered the Vive actually because I was excited about the room scale and the controllers right off the bat, and then just fell in love with it immediately. My background is in sequential art, and I minored in concept art for games. So I've wanted to be a video game artist ever since I was in middle school or elementary school. VR was just such a natural fit with all the skills that I'd been learning through school.
So what's sequential art? Are you talking about like animation or?
That was my major in SCAD. So we all graduated from Savannah College of Art and Design spring of 2017. My major was called sequential art. And essentially for that major, you learn how to draw comic books. But it's more of narrative storytelling. So we learn every form of design, from graphic design to character design, environment art, typography, like bottom up. We have to make comics from scratch ourselves. And that kind of teaches you all the skill sets and the tools that you need in order to tell a story entirely visually through a narrative sequence.
That's very cool. A long time ago in a previous life of mine, I wrote a comic book just because I wanted to see what it was like, and I partnered up with an illustrator, and I wrote it, he illustrated it, published it, sold a couple of hundred in Comic-Cons, and I'm like, okay, check that off the bucket list.
That's awesome.
So that was fun. Christian, what about you?
So I actually got into VR because of Remy here. Whenever he got his Samsung Gear VR, I went over to his house and we tried it out. Did some like 360 videos and some random mobile games that were on there. And so my background is actually majored in game development at SCAD. Originally game artist, but kind of shifted into programming. I was in this constant battle between art and programming because SCAD was more focused on the art side, but I also love the tech and the programming and the logic behind it.
So are you the programmer of the group right now?
Yes, I am.
Oh, you are. And what about you, Remy? What's your function within your team there?
My official title is Director of Hype, but I essentially do all the 2D art for the game. So I do all the logos, graphic design, posters, typography, that kind of stuff. And I also do a bunch of 3D. So I did like the characters, a lot of the contraband, random props in the environment, that kind of stuff.
Very cool. And you said your title was Director of Hype?
Yeah, that's right.
I love that title. I want that title. It's very cool. So next up, Preston, you're up. Let me guess. You got into it because of Remy too.
Absolutely. It was a mixture of Remy and a couple of my other buddies that were heavily into VR that also had VR headsets here. I graduated with a major in game design, but with a minor in sound design. And I really got into VR because as a sound designer, virtual reality just opens up this opportunity for audio because you're now able to spatialize audio. And audio is one of those things that really helps sell the immersion of VR. And so I really wanted to get into it. And we all actually got together and did a game jam where we did this small game called Lighthouse Down VR, where you were literally put onto a island where there was a lighthouse and you had to climb your way up and you had to make sure you were on the right side or else a wave would come and throw you off the building. And so it was just this climbing simulation. We did it in a couple of days and it was very fun, especially for me to do it, my first time doing audio for VR.
That's pretty awesome. How long did it take you guys to get up to speed to, I'm assuming you're using Unity, right?
Well, actually, we're using Unreal Engine 4.
Oh, you're using Unreal Engine. Okay, but how long did it take you to get up to speed? Because is TSA Frisky your second after that test you did, but your real first deliverable or production?
For me and Christian, actually, we've done a deliverable for a VR game before. We helped create a virtual reality game called Dialect Effect, where we utilized voice recognition in virtual reality to teach people Mandarin. It was this awesome opportunity we had, and it's actually how we got to meet our creative director that's here at SCAD Plus with us.
That is so cool. Very cool. Is that available on Steam or anything, or is that like an internal app?
I think that's more of an internal project.
Game Jam website. I know you can get it on the Game Jam website, but I'm not sure if the build is one that is functional.
Yeah, it was definitely more of an internal thing with SCAD, our college, back whenever we were working on it, because they're the ones who actually brought us all together to make it for them. But they've been showing it everywhere. They showed it at GDC this past year at the Intel competition, and they got a lot of great feedback, and a lot of people really enjoyed it.
What did you guys pick, Unreal over Unity? And, this isn't a religious kind of war thing, but it's, I know people get really into that, but no, it's just wondering what makes you pick one over the other as a developer.
Well, for us, that was basically like our main thing that we know. We've done Unity back in the past before, but that was just for a game jam that we did. Most of our knowledge has been in Unreal. Me and Christian have been developing in it for the past 2 or 3 years. And so it's something that we know. And for our first game coming out, we really wanted to play to our strengths. And now we're kind of seeing how we want to shift to Unity just to kind of diversify how we are as a team.
So that means, Christian, you're the programmer, you're coding C++.
So right now I'm actually using visual scripting just for efficiency and speed's sake.
Oh, Blueprint? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But our next title, we do plan on diving into Unity and using C# just simply because it's more flexible with VR.
Right. Okay, cool. So let's jump in and let's talk about QA, which is everybody's most favorite topic. Absolutely not. Okay. But we're still going to talk about that. But that's really, really important, right? That's an important part of developing and releasing a good title, correct?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about QA and beta testing. And why don't we start by basically, what's the difference between that?
So I would say QA is more or less something that you do consistently throughout your production cycle. It's something that you do even with your alpha. You have people play your game as you're developing it and making sure you find all the bugs. Beta testing is whenever you're able to release it to your users to where there's very little bugs that you don't really know of, that only users that haven't really played your game would be able to really figure out on their own because this is their first time really experiencing your game. But beta is almost little to no bugs. That's typically released probably about a week to 2 weeks, even sometimes a month before the actual full title is released. So there should be little to no bugs happening there, while usual in-house quality assurance teams are just testing all throughout production.
So QA is internal, really the internal team doing its work and making sure that it's as bug-free as possible. And beta testing is putting it out there and letting the users maybe find stuff that you missed, or just other kinds of testing like gameplay testing or functionality testing.
Exactly.
How is testing for VR games different than testing for like flat games, what we call flat games? I don't know. What do you call those that are not VR?
I like to call them traditional games.
Old school. No, let's call them old school. Let's make people like feel really old now.
Yeah, exactly.
It's making me feel old too.
Exactly. Right. Okay. So let's say traditional games versus VR games. Is there a difference in testing?
Well, there's a lot of standing up. On programming, I'll constantly be getting out of my chair, getting in the headset and testing different things. The biggest thing, especially like while programming in VR, is the fact that it's hard to debug like on the fly. So it ends up turning into just a bunch of print strings on your screen just to make sure that things are firing correctly.
But let me ask you a question on that, because when you do that, like in a traditional game, right, you can open up the console and see what's going on.
Yeah.
But when you're in VR, how do you go back and forth? Is there a console that you can see inside VR, or do you like raise your head up, and look down where they have little holes through your HMD to see what's going on?
Well, I mean, you can still see the console in VR, but I normally don't use it that much. I literally just use print strings, so I'll just end up having like lines of text just all throughout my screen while I'm in VR.
In the actual experience. So you're dumping it to the experience.
Yeah.
That's one of the ways that it's different. You've got to stand up a lot. You're in the HMD, so instead of looking at the console, you got to throw stuff to the actual display. Any other things you guys can point out that is a bit different?
So there's an infinite possibility of reactions that a player can have to any given scenario you put them in. You can put a player in a white box, and every person who goes into that white box will do a different thing in that box. So whenever Christian gets something working, the first thing he'll do is have me and Preston come over and test it. And the first thing we do is try and break it as much as possible. So we'll stick it through geometry. We'll stick our face through geometry. We'll spam buttons. We'll try and just act kind of erratic to figure out what is broken. Once we do break it, we try and replicate that as efficiently as possible so to help him identify what is causing that bug.
And that's different than traditional because you have more freedom of movement because of the room scale and the fact that you can grab stuff and things like that?
There's just such a variety of things you can do. So if you give a player a gun in a regular game, they can fire it at things, they can reload. There's only like a handful of commands you can do. But if you give a player a gun in VR, there's an infinite number of things they can do with that. They can manipulate it with either hand. They can whack it against things. They can throw it away. They can lose it. There's like just so much more variety that you have to account for in VR. And you kind of have to have this balancing act between how much do you really tailor that experience to what you intend for them to do with it versus how much freedom you give the player to really just explore the game and have fun with it.
How mentally exhausting is this? Seriously, all kidding aside. I mean, because you're in the VR headset for hours coding and playing and testing, but when you officially get into the QA test and do all this, and you got to do it over and over and over, I mean, are you exhausted by the end of the day?
I mean, it's literally a pain in the neck. It is exhausting for sure, just being in and out of VR all day. And like sometimes it can be really frustrating since it can be really hard to figure out exactly what's going wrong in the game.
I've actually been debating trying to find us some VR monkeys for the coders who can just sit in VR all day and like be the test dummies, and that way the coders can code on the computer and then have the VR monkeys relay information and do tests and be patient in the headset.
So there's another thing that's also very different opposed to like environment design, level design is the way that you have to design your levels for VR is, I would say, a more interactive process physically for the environment artist and level designer, because you basically take exactly what Christian was saying about getting in and out of the headset. Whenever you're laying out a block out, you basically have to be getting in and out, making sure that everything's to the correct proportion, that everything is staying within your play space, because you have to basically map out your play space and make sure that this play space is applicable for any user that's out there. And so you have to constantly be in and out of VR whenever you do changes.
So that means you got to take into account like the player size, the height.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And the best way you can do that is just getting in yourself, especially if for all of us, we're pretty tall, but I'd like to say I'm kind of like average for my height. No,
we're all about we're 6 foot or over. So when we have children playing the game, they always take note on how big everything seems. But to us, the game feels very small.
Right. For me, it would be big. I say I'm 5'6", but I'm 5'5.5", but I like to round up.
But just getting in yourself and actually proportioning everything out according to yourself gives you a nice reference of the type of people that you'll be playing, and also allows you to shorten things or heighten things easier whenever you're actually getting into VR.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, speaking of HMDs, how many HMDs do you have to test it with? Does it really matter, or are they all pretty standardized?
It does. Right now, because they're constantly coming out and they're all relatively new, they all have little quirks about them that make them behave differently. So we test on the Vive, the Oculus, and the Windows mixed reality headsets. We personally use a Samsung Odyssey, and we do that because between like the Odyssey and the Vive are fairly similar, even though the controls on the Odyssey are a little different. But the Oculus between the Vive has some quirks to it. So the orientations of the hands will be different. The physical buttons on the controllers are different. Sometimes even just the way that the game reacts to optimization can be different. The Oculus can have this almost liquidy effect to kind of help with the frame rate issues sometimes, whereas the Vive will kind of just stutter. So testing between them is really important.
And I would imagine like between all three of them, even tracking like room scale, one is inside out, the other one is much smaller, the other one is much bigger, and what may work in the Vive from like if you got to reach behind you to grab something, let's say in your game, it would be different, and you got to test that to make sure that it works with an inside-out tracker as well.
Absolutely. One thing we consciously did towards the beginning of the development was to lay out our play space to all fit within a 180-degree field of view facing forward. That way, if you're on Oculus and you only have the two sensors turning around 180 degrees to use something that's functional in the game and the tracking messes you up, that's not a pleasant experience. So we intentionally kept everything to the front half of the play space, at least the stuff that's necessary to play the game. And that way it keeps the tracking issues to a minimum across the headsets.
What about QAing for like the standalones now, like the Oculus Go? Are you guys even targeting those yet?
Not yet. Our game requires a 6DoF room scale experience, and we try as hard as we can to make it standing friendly, but realistically you want enough room to walk around at least a little bit in our game. We very much wanted to play up the movement of VR and like the physicality of it, having people move from one end of the space to the other and from high to low, and it's very fun to see people being very active within the game when they play. So we really wanted to encourage that kind of play style.
Sure, and that brings in the immersion too, right?
Yeah, so on the Oculus Go and those kinds of headsets, they're currently all 3DoF, and there are 6DoF mobile headsets in the works, but they're not released to the market yet. So we're hopeful that we can move into that market in the future, but for now we're on PC.
Like the Focus.
Mm-hmm.
How do you QA the audio?
I literally get in there and I test it myself, and also just have people get in, like some of my friends and our other audio designer that I have contract out, come in and just test it themselves, making sure whenever they hear something, like say for instance something is to the right, they'll actually start looking to the right. You have to just make sure that the source radiuses are to the right size and scale to where they'll actually sound like they're panning from your right to left ears.
Right. And what about taking into account like room noise itself, the room where they're going to be playing? How do you take that into account? Meaning that, your experience sounds good even with like crappy headphones.
Yeah. Well, surprisingly, a lot of the headsets that are coming out now that we're working with, so the HTC Vive that has the audio strap, the Oculus that already comes with headphones, and the new HTC Vive Pro comes with headphones. A lot of these things are coming with their own headphones, and it's actually worked out pretty well to where I've just been able to test with those, and those aren't the world's best headphones, but they do a really solid job. And most of the time it's just they do a pretty good job themselves. So
once you find bugs, how do you track these bugs? Is there like a bug tracker that's focused more in VR, or do you use just a traditional like Jira or some other app like that?
So the best technique I found is literally just sticky notes. So I'll just write it down on a sticky note and then stick it on my monitor, and I'll check it off whenever I fix the bug.
I see. So you're not using any kind of tool to manage all bugs and...
No, not necessarily.
He's more of like a hands-on guy. He really, really loves his sticky notes.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And honestly, it's just you, right, doing the coding. So it could kind of make sense. But as your team grows, obviously.
As our team grows, we definitely go into more of an Excel spreadsheet on doing bugs, or even doing a Trello page on certain bugs.
What about when you beta test? Did you guys beta test? And if you did, how did you track any feedback from users?
So we had our demo that was released, and people could access our testing survey that we have out for them. And so we had a series of questions that were linked to our Google Doc, and we would be provided all the answers, and we'd have certain graphs depending on the answers, like how many said yes, how many said no, all that good stuff. And so the actual survey that we created was terrific.
Yeah, I can see how that helps out. Now, normally, when you're in a web app or whatever, you get a bug, you can take a quick screenshot of that. Can you do that in VR? And would that even help?
It actually does help, but I know Steam VR actually has a hotkey for taking a screenshot and saving it out for you. And we actually, for our full launch, we set up an email specifically for reporting bugs so that users can reach out to us, report bugs, and we can keep up with them. We do ask that users do send either a screenshot or a GIF or a video to help us out, to help identify when the bug happens and how it can be replicated.
Now, the Oculus Go, I don't know, I'm sure you guys tried it already, has, and I know you guys aren't targeting that, but has a really cool recording feature that you can record anything that you're doing within the Oculus Go, and you can save it to your Oculus Go and then move it to your computer, or you can actually Facebook Live with it. Have you guys looked into that? And do you know if there's anything like that for like the Rift or the Vive?
As far as we know, I don't think there's anything like that. I know that NVIDIA has built-in video recording software that we use a lot to capture bugs that we find like randomly. It'll save the previous 2 minutes of footage, and that's been helpful for us. But for us, most of the time, if we find a bug, the first thing we need to do is replicate it and figure out what's causing it.
Oh, so NVIDIA has sort of some sort of recording engine that you can do within VR?
I think it's called Shadow Play.
But I'm not sure can you do that in VR?
Yeah, I mean, you can set it up so that Shadowplay will automatically record like the last 2 minutes or 5 minutes, however long you want of gameplay. So while you're playing in VR, if you find a bug, if you get out of VR and just like press the hotkey, Shadowplay will automatically save out that recording for you.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know if there's anything like readily available like on the controller just to press while you're in VR to actually record it.
That's built into the graphics cards.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess you can mirror to the desktop and record the desktop, right? I guess you could do that too.
Yeah.
There's different kinds of bugs. Maybe you can talk about different kinds of bugs, like syntax errors and logical bugs. Can you talk about those different kinds of bugs and how do you QA for those?
So at least for the logical bugs, what I'll do is when I hop into Engine and I'll hop into the game, I'll actually Alt-Tab back into the engine so that I can see the sequence of events that are happening within the code so that I can make sure that, what needs to happen is happening at the right time. And if it's not happening, I can jump through it and create breakpoints so that I can step through the code and like one frame at a time and see what's causing the problems.
Because that's the beauty about visual scripting is like it'll actually show you from left to right when things are firing and if the logic is actually going through to where you need it to go to.
Oh, I see. So visually you're seeing it jump from box to box, basically, where you're at in the code.
Exactly.
In a game, there's various combinations. You can do a lot of things, right? How do you account for all those combinations? Do you have like test user cases that you write down in your sticky notes, of course, not on an app? Do you go through those? I mean, you obviously have to have some sort of user test cases, I would imagine.
Yeah. Okay. We definitely do try and cover as many like specific use cases as we can with our testing. However, it's going to be impossible to test everything before shipping. So it's actually been really funny. We've been watching Let's Plays come out of the game and we'll see people do things that we didn't even know were possible. Like people keep our grab right now. We have a thing where you can grab your wand scanner and then while you're using it to search a passenger, you can grab the scanner out of your other hand and then it won't let go of the other hand. So it's like some weird things that like we don't ever bother trying to do ourselves just because we know what we're supposed to be doing. So seeing other people play it who have never played the game before definitely helps us in that sense. And that's why with our next game, instead of just releasing it as we have it, we're going to try and do early access first. And we were honestly a little like, we were on the fence about it at first because we've seen a lot of VR games currently on the market launching early access. And we thought it was, because they're, still in development. They're kind of trying to build an audience. We're realizing now it's just because of that, there's such a huge variety of use cases that you honestly need the massive amounts of players to go through your game and figure out those, more bizarre and wacky scenarios that come out of just interactions in VR.
Like an interesting case of something that we've tested, something that we've seen that we weren't necessarily testing for, but that we've seen from people just playing our game is, so if somebody picks up a clicker, right, a projector clicker with one hand, they always try to use their other hand to press the buttons on that clicker. And for us, we just programmed it to where all you'd have to do is just press right on the thumb pad. But a lot of people would just try to do it with their other hand. And so that was just good testing data for us to be like, okay, we need to implement this because a lot of people are doing it.
Right. Because, people feel like they're really in the experience and they want to do it like they would do it in real life.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we've definitely moved a lot away from shortcuts and more towards one-to-one interactions. And currently the whole game is playable with 2 buttons, but we're going to try and look through and see if we can get that down to just the triggers because it makes the learning of the experience a lot more accessible and easier for people to get into.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about UI and UX testing? Like, what I mean by that, let me give you an example. Let's say you make some things are draggable or you can grab some things. and some things you can't. How do you test for, number one, that those are working correctly, but then number two, that maybe what you thought shouldn't be grabbable, everybody else thinks, oh, why can't I grab this?
Like, so for us, like in VR, kind of like UI, user experience, we kind of take the same philosophy for something like Job Simulator does, is try to make everything that is in the player's surroundings interactable, making sure that they're able to pick up everything that they think they're able to pick up. So currently in our break room, everything in the vicinity of your play space, you're actually able to interact with. That's something that we really valued and we really got into. We brought on an external interactions programmer, we call him, because he literally went in and did a bunch of interactions, and that's only put our game up on the next level. And so many people are just blown away with the amount of interaction that you're able to do within your play space.
In terms of UI, we strayed away as much as we could from just floating HUD elements. We definitely did decide to put some in there because we found that text is very easily ignorable in VR. We're not entirely sure what causes it, but we can put, like, we have a gigantic sign that has the clock on it on top of the passenger scanner. People will be looking directly at it, like, you know, dead center of their vision, and we're telling them, look at the clock and like make sure you don't run out of time, and they say, where is the clock? Yeah. So there are certain cases like that where we decided to put some floating text and we gave it a little bit of movement so that it draws your eye to it. Because if it's stagnant, then people will tend to ignore it. But if it's bouncing up and down a little bit, or if there's a little bit of movement to it, it catches your eye and you know that it's important. So we have like the trash cans labeled, and in the break room we have the tutorial clicker labeled and the start level handle labeled. And that way you have a direction that's not super intrusive. But outside of those few things, everything else is integrated within the world so that it kind of makes sense in VR, and it helps with the immersion.
So like whenever you go into the next level, there is a door to your right. You're going to pull that door handle and you're going to go into the environment. So mixing, rather than having a button to go into someplace, you actually have that interaction that VR needs to go to the next level.
Right, making the interface to whatever be the content.
Exactly.
What about automating some of this testing? Are there tools for VR now, or is this too early in the industry for that?
So automation for like interactions and stuff like that is, as far as I know, currently not available. But there is some automation that at least Unreal has for mostly testing things like frames, post-processing, like seeing how long it takes for things to render. And that's huge for us for optimization, because we can go through and see exactly what is causing a drop in frames, whether it be like a post-processing effect that's happening, translucency. Like we did have a problem with translucency, especially in our last level, which was a spaceport, because we have huge windows. And so what we did to actually help alleviate that, I forget exactly what it's called, but
we use the, so there is a way to use the dither temporal AA method, where you plug that into your opacity channel in your material editor, and it basically turns off every other pixel. So it's not just being full blast all glass. It's actually optimizing itself, but gives off the same effect, but more in an optimized way of real glass.
And actually, that's my next question is actually kind of related to performance. And how do you test for performance? Does Unreal have built-in tools for that, or do you use a separate kind of tool?
They have built-in tools. They have, specifically what we use a lot is the GPU visualizer. It'll basically take a screen capture of your scene currently whenever you're in play, and it will line out how many milliseconds it is taking to render that one frame. And typically whenever you're striving to hit 90 frames per second, you're going to want 11 milliseconds of time to render that one frame. And so we're able just to see exactly what Christian was talking about in that visualizer, what's causing it, what the base pass is, how many milliseconds that's taking, and also the translucency and post-processing.
So is there something you've learned through this testing for performance-wise that you can just give one tip to all developers saying, hey, make sure you do this and your performance is going to improve by X amount of percentage?
For VR, I would say use post-processing as little as possible, especially if you're trying to do some awesome shader for your game, especially if it's a global shader that will be running through your post-processing. Post-processing can be very expensive, very, very expensive, because it's a global thing. It will be happening everywhere within your scene, and it's going to affect every single object. So that takes a lot of time to render. But if you're only messing with color values like hue and saturation of your colors, or even like the color of your shadows and stuff, that's pretty all right. But once you start getting into doing materials like a toon shader or simple outlines on a lot of things, that can really be taxing on your game.
We also found that geometry is actually fairly inexpensive, at least on PC. You can have quite a lot of geometry in VR, and it doesn't impact performance too much.
Also, one thing that's hugely expensive is the amount of AI that you have or characters that you have in your scene that have movable parts, because those take a lot of, like, we've just found that we can't have too many passengers coming into your scene at once. We have to just, like, the way we've got about doing it is having them come in at different times. So we try to time it as well as the person will get done with this one and it will spawn another AI coming in. But having multiple AI and characters in your environment is very taxing.
Well, and this brings up a question in my mind about, it's about AI, but really it's about like the 360-degree view. Let's say you're QAing something that's happening in front of you and you're focusing on that, but you also have some AI robots behind you, doing whatever they're doing. How do you QA for that? Because, I mean, you got to be going back and forth, or do you set up a separate test case for stuff that is not focused in the story at times, but you still have to make sure that it's working right? Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean because of 360, but it's funny, we actually haven't had to worry about that. Because we consciously designed our game with 180-degree play space, most players will look around initially, and then they'll be really focused on the passengers right after that. And it helps that our game is very chaotic and fast-paced, so you don't really have you don't have any downtime to really explore the environment. And we don't have anything going on behind you that's important or that would draw your attention away. It's mostly just environment and aesthetics. So because the player's always focused on the front, that's really like where the bulk of the testing is done, I guess.
I guess that question would be more appropriate for a game that allows you to do full room scale and there's stuff going around everywhere, right?
Yeah. Our game has no movement either within the game or when you're outside in the real room, you can move around a little bit, but you can't traverse the environment too much. So you're really you're planted there at your post doing your job and you're focused on your work. Yeah, definitely.
Perfect TSA agent.
Right, exactly. I was going to say that. I just don't want to get emails. What about version control? Do you guys use version control?
Yeah, so we use Perforce. I actually set it up on an Amazon server for us. It's been absolutely vital to our production. Perforce has saved our project many times. Problems will go wrong and we can just simply revert to a previous version. It also just makes it easy to collaborate with each other. Like if I want Remy to upload a few models so I can implement them, he just throws them in Engine and adds it to Perforce, uploads them, and I can get them 2 seconds later.
And this is available online, you said?
Yeah, so Perforce is free for, I think, a team up to 5. But essentially what we do is that we make 5 users and then you can have up to 20 workspaces with those 5 users. So we just tend to share users.
I know your game doesn't support networking capabilities like multiple users to go online, but are you guys looking at that to add to this game or for future games? And do you have any thoughts or ideas from a QA perspective? Because I would imagine that's a whole specialty right there.
Mm-hmm. So for our future game, we definitely want to dive into networking. Mostly because we want to look into the social aspect of VR and mess around with that. For QA, for networking, I know that load testing is a big part of it, and just figure out how many users you can have on a server at one time. And then it just like programming in general around multiplayer is a lot different because you have to figure out what is being done on the server side versus the client side.
So continue along that. We really want to make a game that we all want to play regularly together. So hopefully the testing part of it will come from us naturally wanting to play the game. And it's with collecting users, one of the reasons we wanted to do an early access for the next game was specifically to try and start building that user base to collect bugs and feedback earlier on. So when we do release, we can put out a more polished product.
Well, and I would imagine that even if you guys play a lot of it, right, testing 5 users at the same time is going to be a lot different than testing 100 users or 1,000 users.
Of course.
What about regression testing? Do you guys do a lot of that?
So we definitely have to go back and test older features, especially if we end up updating them, because new updates can introduce new bugs to the game, and you never know what might happen with mechanics that you've already implemented, or if you've implemented new mechanics that have to work with old mechanics.
Yeah, we've learned the hard way that adding new features will make the old ones break. So that's definitely something we have to go back and bug fix a lot.
And I would imagine that you have to do a lot of that also if you're like updating to the latest version of Unity, right? And you're bringing in your old projects. You got to make sure that even what Unity introduces doesn't break your current stuff, right? Or in your case, it's Unreal, but for any engine, I guess.
We updated to 4.19. We were on 4.18, but 4.19 actually introduced a few new changes with even just the motion controllers. So I had to go back and change up how the motion controllers were set, because they literally just used a different variable for whether or not it was a left hand or a right hand, and it was just something that I had to go back and change.
There's also we've had to update in versions before because in the environment, so I also do all the lighting. And so in one of the previous versions of Unreal, something happened where just the lighting was just broken for whatever reason that we just could not figure out. Basically, all dynamic shadows were stuck in this one circle in the center of the screen always. And it was just this weird bug that we didn't know how to fix. And there was nobody that had this same bug that was anywhere on the internet that we could find. And so we basically had to update to the next version and then have to test to make sure all the lighting works just fine. And miraculously and happily, it did.
See, and they say doing VR games, it's an awesome thing. Sometimes it can be really frustrating, right?
It can be, most definitely. That's the beauty in it, because there's the balance in between the good and the bad, which makes it all worth it.
Well, it's also a challenge, right? Sometimes having a bug, I know it's not quote unquote fun, but the challenge of the discovery process of finding what's causing this, the feeling you get that once you figured it out, right?
Exactly. It's so rewarding, and you learn so much just from trying to figure out this little bug. You get something that is very valuable, which is your problem solving skills, and just staying up to date with all that is just crucial to any development process.
How long is your QA period? Do you break it down into phases like design, development, QA, or does it come to a point where you go, okay, we're done, we give up, I'm tired, let's just publish this?
Well, for us, it's just constant QA all the time. There's no certain phase in which we go through this phase and then we stop for a little bit and then go to another phase. It's just always constant, from even pre-production, just testing out our idea by talking to people, to production, to where we're actively testing mechanics consistently, to post-production where we're just testing updates. It's just, there's no break in between it. It might be various different parts of your whole development cycle, but it's just always constant QA until you're pretty much finally done with the game, which I don't think is necessarily ever done.
Right. You never finish software projects, you just give up.
Exactly.
But yeah, we didn't have set phases. We're a small team, so we constantly had to be moving back and forth. So we would do art tests, blockout tests, mechanical tests, testing the frame rate, all that kind of stuff throughout the entire project. It was nonstop.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, guys, unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I really want to thank you for being here. You guys shared a wealth of information. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
I do have one last question that I like to ask all my guests, which is describe what you would like VR to be in 2025, or whatever date you want it to be.
That's interesting. I'd love if a lot of people, if it was more if it was way more consumer friendly, to where it was to the price point at which consoles are today, to where it's accessible for everyone just to be able to have in their homes, just like most of everyone has either PlayStation 4 or an Xbox One. Just to have that ability, just to have everybody come in and everybody embrace what virtual reality is.
For me, I think virtual reality should turn us into cyborgs, where contact lenses and full body suits for haptics.
I definitely am on board with all that. I want it to be a household thing. I want VR and AR and this whole immersive technology industry to sort of become a household thing where kind of like cell phones are now, where it's just something that everyone has on them at all times. And some people use it more than others, and some cases can be more effective than others. And I'm sure we'll have a bunch of, interesting dilemmas coming out of it, but I think that it'll help us overall.
Can we wish for Ready Player One type stuff?
Definitely.
Mine is the dystopian part.
Mine is the dystopian part, exactly.
Yeah. But I'm totally with you on the Ready Player One stuff. By the way, did you guys watch the movie?
Yes. We thought it was very fun, but the way that they showed what virtual reality is, it's kind of interesting.
It was a little goofy with the transparent HMDs.
Right. They're more like AR HMDs, right?
Exactly. But having those suits to where you can actually feel like stuff, and like when you get a shot, you're able to feel that. That's really cool.
Yeah,
well, and that's happening.
The Void, and it was a life-changing experience for me.
The Void?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Which one did you do?
Anything that tries to push that level of immersion. So having the feedback in your torso and having your friends there with you, even just using the leap motion to give you your hands a sense of presence was phenomenal.
Having the actual physical space mapped out with the virtual space to where you see a wall and you touch that wall in the virtual space, but you're actually touching that same wall in physical space. Just having that really immerses you in there, which is so freaking cool to me as an environment artist. That's so awesome.
I agree 100%. I did which Void did you do? The Star Wars?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did that one too here in Glendale in Southern California. There were times where I wanted to lean against a wall and I was afraid because I've done it before with my Rift and I've fallen, right?
Yeah, I've definitely
and then I realized, no, it's mapped, so it's okay, go against the wall. And it's the best feeling when you're trying to hide and you're lean against the wall and there's a wall there. Or you press a button and there's a button. It's totally different.
I love the parts where they actually had heat or fans,
Oh, yeah, the lava.
Making the environment actually react to the visuals. That was cool. That was next level.
Agree. Well, guys, I feel like we can talk for a lot longer, but we're done. So no, seriously,
Yes.
I really appreciate it. Why don't we go around the table, give a URL or your Twitter, whatever you guys want.
Well, I'll go ahead and start off. Like I said, I'm Preston O'Brien. You can find out a lot more about our game at www.tsafrisky.com, and you'll be able to keep up to date with us as a team also through that.
Yeah, that's pretty much the main one. Go to tsafrisky.com. You can find links to everything on there. I think even our websites are linked through our pictures. So easy to find us all.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Remy, Christian, and Preston. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with me. If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and like us on iTunes or SoundCloud. For more episodes, check out howtocreatevr.com/iTunes or howtocreatevr.com/SoundCloud. If you are ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. Finally, if you are interested in learning more about how to create VR, AR, and MR experiences, please visit howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.